An old man kneels on a hillside just outside of Rome. It's the middle of the 1st century, and the city behind him is still smoking in places from a fire that swept through it not long ago, a fire the emperor blamed on people like him. His wrists are bound behind him with rope that has already cut through skin, and 2 soldiers are working above him, driving a wooden beam into the dry ground, and they're turning it upside down. He asked them to. He insisted on it, in fact. Which is strange, because you would think a man facing the last hour of his life would ask for anything except the version of it that hurts more. A small crowd has gathered nearby, the way crowds always gathered for executions in Rome. Some out of curiosity, some out of hatred, a few, quietly, out of grief. We'll get to why he made that request. Not yet. This isn't a story about martyrdom. It isn't a story about tragedy or about 12 tombstones scattered across 3 continents. It's a story about 12 people who had the least reason on earth to lie and the most reason to run. Think about what they actually saw, not what they believed, what they saw with their own eyes in daylight, standing close enough to touch it. A body publicly executed on a Friday afternoon in front of witnesses, wrapped in burial cloth, sealed behind a stone that took several men to move, and then, according to every single one of them, walking around a beach 3 days later, eating fish, showing scars, asking for breakfast. Nobody gets tortured to death defending a metaphor. Nobody lets a man peel the skin off their body for a comforting story they invented about a dead friend. Something happened to these 12 men that took lying completely off the table, even when lying was the only thing standing between them and the worst deaths the Roman world knew how to design. Most of what we know about how they died doesn't actually come from the Bible itself. The New Testament is almost silent on the subject. What we have instead comes from something quieter. The early church historians, men like Eusebius of Caesarea, writing in the 4th century, piecing together fragments, letters, and local memory about where each apostle ended up and how each one's life closed. These are traditions, not courtroom transcripts. Some are stronger than others, some rest on almost nothing at all. But lay all 12 accounts side by side, weak and strong together, and a pattern still shows up that none of them reveal on their own. Every one of these men had an exit available to him. Every one of them knew the 4 words that would have saved his life. I did not see him. Rome didn't actually want more bodies. Rome wanted silence, and silence was cheap. 11 of them never said it. Start with the one Scripture actually records directly, because it matters that this one isn't tradition. It's history, written down while people who could have disputed it were still alive to do so. James, son of Zebedee, a Galilean fisherman, brother of John, one of the 3 men Jesus trusted enough to bring up a mountain and let him watch him transfigured in light no one else was allowed to see. Around the year 44, roughly a decade after the resurrection, King Herod Agrippa I decides to move against the growing movement in Jerusalem, and he doesn't arrest James quietly. He has him beheaded publicly as a message to everyone watching. The book of Acts gives it one sentence. One sentence for the execution of a man who watched Jesus die and then watched him alive again. And right up until that blade came down, James had exactly the same 4 words available to him that everyone else did. He never used them. Andrew, Peter's brother, the one who first brought Peter to meet Jesus in the first place, travels north into Greece, into a city called Patras on the northern coast of the Peloponnese. When the local governor there, a man named Aegeates, demands he stop preaching and make sacrifice to the Roman gods, Andrew refuses, and he's sentenced to crucifixion. The oldest surviving accounts of what happens next don't describe some elaborate shape of cross. That detail, the X-shaped cross people picture today, is actually a much later medieval addition. What the earliest sources agree on is simpler, and in some ways worse. He was bound to the cross with rope instead of nailed to it, deliberately, specifically so death would come slower. And by every early account that survives, Andrew spent the better part of 2 days on that cross still preaching to the crowd that had gathered to watch him die. Try to imagine the effort of simply breathing under that kind of strain. Now imagine spending what breath you have left talking about the man who caused all of this. That's not the behavior of someone protecting a lie. That's someone who has run out of reasons to stay quiet. Not every apostle's story ends that way, though, and the one that doesn't matters as much as the ones that do. John, James's younger brother, is the one tradition holds died an old man of natural causes, decades after everyone else in that circle of 12 was already gone. He wasn't spared because he was less committed. If anything, Rome tried harder with him than almost anyone else. Early tradition claims he survived an attempt to boil him alive and oiled in Rome before he was exiled to Patmos, a barren, wind-scoured island the empire used specifically to make troublesome people disappear from public memory. It was there, alone, cut off from every friend he'd ever had, that he wrote about a vision so overwhelming it knocked him flat on the ground before he could even speak. You'd expect a prison island to be exactly where a testimony finally cracks under the weight of isolation. Instead, it's where John wrote some of the most defiant lines in the entire New Testament. By then, he had outlived every friend from that upper room. He'd watched, one by one, the reports come in: James beheaded, Andrew crucified, and still more to come. He never once used his own survival as an excuse to soften a single word of what he'd seen. 3 men. 3 completely different endings, the same thing sitting underneath every one of them. There are 9 more of them, and the pattern only gets harder to explain away the further you go. So stay with me for the rest, and if this kind of history is your thing, go ahead and subscribe now, because we walk through stories like this every week, the ones most churches simply don't have time for on a Sunday morning. Philip settles in a city called Hierapolis in what is now western Turkey, a place soaked in pagan worship, built around a temple to a serpent god the locals believed guarded an actual gateway down into the underworld. It was not friendly territory for a man preaching a resurrection. Philip does it anyway, and tradition holds that he converts the wife of a high-ranking Roman official in that city, a woman with everything material to lose, who apparently decided she had nothing left to fear once she'd heard what Philip had to say. Her husband did not take the news well. Philip is arrested and, according to most traditions, executed in Hierapolis, with some accounts saying he was crucified there, upside down, for the crime of convincing one woman that the God he served outranked the serpent everyone else in that city had been raised to fear. Then there's Bartholomew, sometimes called Nathaniel, the disciple Jesus once described the very first time they met as a man with no deceit in him at all. Tradition carries him east into Armenia, a rugged, mountainous kingdom far from anything familiar to a Galilean fisherman. And what tradition records happening to him there is brutal enough that most retellings soften it. We won't. He was flayed, the skin removed from his body while he was still alive, and only then beheaded. For centuries afterward, painters depicted him holding his own skin draped over one arm, which tells you something about how this detail was remembered. It was specific enough and fixed enough in local memory across generations that art historians generally treat it as too particular to have been simply invented out of nothing later on. Which brings us to Thomas, and to the thread this whole video opened with, though you may not have noticed it yet. You know Thomas as the doubter, the one who wouldn't believe the others when they told him Jesus was alive, who said flatly that he needed to put his own fingers into the wounds before he'd say a word about it. And when Jesus actually appeared and offered him exactly that chance, Thomas didn't hesitate for a second. 4 words: "My Lord and my God." Here's the part that ought to stop you. The very man who demanded the most proof before he'd believe anything is the same man that early Christian communities in India, communities that trace an unbroken line back to him, say carried the gospel farther than almost any other apostle, all the way to the Malabar coast and later east to a city near what is now Chennai, where local tradition holds he was killed with a spear for refusing to stop preaching the thing he'd once refused to believe without touching it himself. The doubter died the farthest from home for the exact thing he'd finally seen with his own eyes. From here, the record itself seems to speed up, almost like history couldn't keep pace with how many of these men there actually were. Matthew, a former tax collector, a man his own people had written off as a traitor for collecting money on behalf of Rome,
carries the gospel into either Ethiopia or Persia, depending on which early tradition you follow, and is killed there for refusing to stop preaching to people who had every reason in the world to distrust a former collaborator with the empire. James, son of Alphaeus, called James the Less simply to separate him from the other James you already heard about, goes back to Jerusalem, the very city where he'd watched Jesus die years before, and preaches there anyway, in the streets he'd once walked as a young man with nothing yet to fear. Tradition holds he was thrown from a height, and when the fall alone didn't kill him, finished off with a club. Thaddeus, also called Jude, travels into Persia alongside a fellow apostle named Simon, a man who, before any of this began, had belonged to a violent political faction determined to overthrow Roman rule by force. Simon spent his youth planning armed rebellion. He spent his final years preaching forgiveness instead. Tradition holds both men were martyred together in Persia, Thaddeus by an axe, Simon by being sawn in half. Two men from completely opposite ends of Jewish political life, dying side by side for the exact same testimony. Here's something easy to miss about this whole run of deaths. These men were not executed together in one dramatic sweep that might suggest coordination, or a single Roman order, or a stage spectacle meant to make a point. They died years apart, in different countries, under different local rulers, for different local reasons, on different continents, with absolutely no way to compare notes or check that the others were staying consistent with what they were saying. The Greek word the early church used for people like this was martys, and it simply meant witness, the ordinary word you'd use for anyone testifying to something they'd seen in a courtroom. It did not originally carry any connotation of violent death at all. It came to mean that only because so many witnesses ended up killed specifically for refusing to change what they testified to. The word itself, over time, became a quiet record of what kept happening to these men. Eusebius, the church historian who preserved most of what we now know about these traditions, was writing in the early 4th century. He wasn't present for any of these deaths himself, but he was gathering material that was already circulating, decades and centuries closer to the actual events than we are now, and he preserved it because the early church considered this particular pattern too important to let fade into silence. 9 men, 9 different countries, 9 different ways to die, and not one of them, when the moment finally came, reached for the 4 easy words that would have ended it. Which brings us back to that hillside just outside Rome. Peter, the fisherman who once tried to walk across open water towards Jesus and sank almost immediately, who swore at the Last Supper that he would die before ever denying Jesus, and then denied him 3 separate times before a rooster finished crowing that same night. If any man on earth had a built-in excuse to stay quiet for the rest of his life, it was Peter. He knew, better than any of the other 11, exactly how fast his own courage could collapse under pressure. And yet, decades later, in Rome, under the Emperor Nero, a ruler notorious for using Christians as human torches to light his private garden parties, Peter is arrested and sentenced to crucifixion.
Here's where that opening scene finally makes sense. The earliest surviving source for what happened next comes from the theologian Origen, writing in the 3rd century, whose account was later preserved by Eusebius. According to Origen, Peter made one specific request before he died: crucify him upside down. Not as protest, not as an act of political defiance against Rome. He said, and this is the detail that should undo you, that he wasn't worthy to die in the same position his Lord had died in. It's worth being honest here. This detail doesn't appear in the very earliest Christian writings we have about Peter's death, and some historians think it may have grown out of a popular 2nd century story rather than eyewitness memory. But even the more cautious version of this account agrees on the core of it. Peter died by crucifixion in Rome under Nero, and by every early tradition that survives, went to his death still proclaiming exactly what he'd always proclaimed. Whether or not the cross was literally inverted, the man who once denied even knowing Jesus, twice, to a servant girl in a courtyard, spent his final years making absolutely certain nobody would ever mistake his testimony for a lie he told to save himself. That's not the legacy of a man protecting an invented story. That's the legacy of a man who spent 30 years carrying his worst failure and who was finally given one chance at the very end to answer for it with his life instead of his silence. This isn't a story about a man who found courage out of nowhere. It isn't a story about a myth that simply grew more impressive every time it was retold around the fire. It's a story about a man so certain of what he'd seen alive after being dead that he faced execution without once taking the exit that was sitting right there in front of him the entire time. You've faced a smaller version of this test yourself, almost certainly more than once. Not a Roman cross, but a moment where telling the truth cost you something real, a friendship, a job, a reputation, and lying would have cost you nothing at all. Most people, standing in that exact spot, find some way to soften what they actually know. That's simply how people work under pressure, which is exactly what makes 12 men so difficult to explain away with easy answers. 12 exits, 12 separate chances to walk free with 4 easy words, 11 who never once took them. There's one more thing worth sitting with before we close, because it's the detail that makes the whole pattern make sense. Judas Iscariot doesn't belong anywhere in this story, and that absence isn't an accident. It's the proof sitting underneath everything else.
Judas betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, and once the full weight of what he'd done became undeniable to him, he didn't go on to preach anywhere, or plant a single church, or die defending any testimony at all. He had no testimony left to defend. He ended his own life instead, because he knew the truth better than anyone alive, and it simply wasn't the truth he could go on living inside of. Judas isn't the exception that breaks this pattern. He's the control group. He shows you, in the starkest possible terms, exactly what it looks like when a man's account of events is actually a lie. Silence, collapse, an ending with absolutely nothing left to say for himself. Set that against 11 men who kept talking in 9 different countries, right up until the moment they physically could not talk anymore. So here is what 12 lives and 11 deaths actually leave you with. First, a fact. The strongest evidence for the resurrection was never really a line of text on a page. It was 12 men in 9 different countries, dying under 9 different rulers, decades apart from one another, with absolutely no way to coordinate a shared story, and every single one of their individual accounts landing in the end in exactly the same place. People do not maintain that kind of consistency under real torture for something they know to be a lie. Under enough pressure, people break. These men did not break. Second, what that actually means for you. You will probably never face a literal cross, but you have faced smaller versions of the exact same choice, a moment where telling the truth cost you something, and staying silent would have cost you nothing at all. These men didn't have access to some superhuman courage that simply isn't available to you. What they had was certainty about what they had personally seen, and that certainty is precisely what carried them past the point where lying would have been so much easier. The real question was never whether you're as brave as Peter turned out to be. It's whether you're as certain as he eventually became. And third, the part that should stay with you the longest after this video ends. Every single one of these 12 men had a mother, a hometown, a version of himself as a boy, long before any of this began, who had no idea his life would end on a cross, or under an axe, or on a beach near India, thousands of miles from the only home he'd ever known. Not one of them set out as a young man to become a martyr. They set out to follow a man they had personally watched die, and then, impossibly, watched alive again, standing right in front of them. Everything that happened after that was simply them refusing to pretend they hadn't seen what they'd seen. Which of these 12 stories hit you the hardest? Tell me down in the comments. I read every single one of them. 11 men were handed an easy exit. 11 men said no. And 2,000 years later, you are still hearing about it because they meant it.